For many people, especially in the West, like myself, the Cold War is portrayed as the global struggle between America and the Soviet Union. But this is actually an oversimplistic narrative that not only lacks subtlety, but also ignores the existence entirely of a third player in the geopolitics of the Cold War. I am, of course, referring to China. We did talk about China earlier in the life of this channel, outlining the Civil War fought between the nationalists and the communists, the latter of which triumphed on the mainland in 1949. At that time, Mao Zedong's China and Stalin's Soviet Union were ideologically aligned and quite close to each other. But, as I'm sure many of you are at least peripherally aware, the nations diverged and even went to war with each other. Well, unofficially anyway. So, how did that happen? How did two allies fall out with each other to that degree, eventually realigning world order? I'm your host David, and today we're going to start looking at the Sino-Soviet Split. This is the Cold War. So, as just mentioned, hostilities in China did not end in 1945 simply because the Second World War ended. The Chinese Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists resumed. The war had been suspended so they could both jointly fight the Japanese, but certainly wasn't resolved. With support from Stalin, the communist forces gained the upper hand and by 1949 had effective control over mainland China, pushing the nationalists to Taiwan. In 1950, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, bringing the already close nations even closer together. As part of the treaty, the Soviets agreed to return Soviet-held assets such as Port Arthur, that's modern-day Dalian, and the Chinese Eastern Railway, which were handed over to Chinese control. The treaty also arranged for a $300 million loan from the Soviets to the Chinese to help stabilize and rebuild the country that had been ravaged by over a decade of war. In exchange for this, Mao agreed to recognize the full independence of Mongolia. 1950 also saw China, with Soviet encouragement, provide assistance and support to North Korea. This began as weapons and advisors, but ended up in direct Chinese troop participation in Korea after China felt its geographic integrity being threatened by the rapid advance of UN troops towards the Yalu River. Soviet assistance helped support China's first five-year plan, launched in 1953. The first five-year plan had goals to increase centrally planned industry and agriculture. Now, it's probably at this point we should talk a little bit about everybody's favorite topic, ideology. There was definitely a gap between communist ideologies in the Soviet Union versus in China. So, to explain, orthodox Marxist theory stipulates that a workers' revolution would be led by a politicized and mobilized urban working class. While it can be argued that Russia in 1917 didn't exactly fit Marx's assumptions, Russia at that time certainly had a more significant industrialized working class than China did during their march towards socialist paradise. Mao, however, didn't believe that an industrial vanguard was needed, but that a peasant vanguard could equally move towards socialism. This is an ideological subset that has become known as Maoism and proved itself to be very popular in the latter half of the 20th century in countries with large rural populations seeking to effect change. Okay, so with that, we know that there's an ideological divide between the Soviets and the Chinese. But while Stalin was in power, this divide was actually not a big deal. Mao had no problems accepting Stalin as the global leader of the communist world, which naturally leads us to the question, what happens when Stalin dies? Well, immediately, nothing changed. It wasn't until after the secret speech that changes began to happen. With Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in the Soviet Union came experimentation in reforms in other communist nations, including, of course, China. Although he had reservations regarding de-Stalinization, recognizing that all communist countries were more or less ruled by some form of repressive means, Mao implemented the 100 Flowers campaign, encouraging people, especially intellectuals, to openly express their thoughts and opinions on the situation in China. To quote Mao, "The policy of letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend is designed to promote the flourishing of the arts and the progress of science." Mao's concerns, however, were quickly proven to be correct, and the flood of letters that arrived, openly critical of the regime and its policies, led to the 100 Flowers campaign being shut down by June 1957, replaced by the Anti-Rightist campaign. The Anti-Rightist campaign was designed to find and remove members of the Communist Party who were right-wing. As to what that actually meant, that varied in practice and was applied to those who were critical of the party, to those in favor of implementing capitalist reforms, to those who opposed agricultural collectivization. This campaign, suspiciously close to a Stalinist purge in its nature, lasted until 1959, and over 500,000 people found themselves being persecuted as a result. Keep in mind that this was happening at the same time that people who had been persecuted in the Soviet Union for the same beliefs were being rehabilitated. The shared path these two nations had been on was beginning to diverge, with several issues pushing them apart. Khrushchev's position on seeking peaceful coexistence with the West was met as an almost betrayal of the communist cause in China. While Moscow had concerns about the possible effects of nuclear standoff, Beijing was embracing the idea of the inevitable war that was to be waged. As part of this, Moscow had to cut off the vast majority of its support to the Chinese nuclear program, started in 1955, ironically heavily aided by the Soviets. Not only was Khrushchev concerned about Mao's more cavalier attitude towards the use of nuclear weapons, but he was using the promise of ending Soviet support for Chinese nuclear weapons as leverage to help further a rapprochement with Eisenhower. Keep in mind that even with the ending of support from the Soviet Union, China joined the nuclear club in 1964. Now, in addition to the nuclear issue, Khrushchev and Mao failed to reach agreement during a 1958 visit to Beijing. Up for discussion was the establishment of a joint naval base on the Chinese coast, the Soviets maintaining the Russian tradition of searching for a warm water port with easy access to the open ocean. The discussion soured after Mao accused Khrushchev of trying to take over the Chinese coastline. Mao's unilateral decision in August of that same year to attack Taiwan in an effort to dislodge the Kuomintang added even more strain to the frayed relationship. Khrushchev was worried the Soviet Union would be dragged into a shooting conflict with the West. The Soviet foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, was sent to Beijing to encourage the Chinese to halt their attack, but he was largely ignored. The Chinese only ceased their attack after it became clear they could not win against the US-backed Taiwanese. So, the relationship is strained. The next piece of the straw on the camel's back occurred during the 1959 Tibetan uprising. The Soviets did not involve themselves in the uprising, but did offer moral support to the Tibetans, stating that they had some legitimate grievances. This may not seem like a significant action, but for two countries who were supposed to be ideologically aligned, for one to provide public support for a rebellion in the other was a massive shift. Now, 1960 saw the Soviet Union shoot down a US U-2 spy plane and its pilot, Gary Powers, captured. While a diplomatic incident was certainly created, the resolution between the US and the Soviets was rather anticlimactic, especially for the Chinese. While the Soviets and the Americans were trying to defuse the situation and avoid outright conflict, Beijing was organizing demonstrations and running a propaganda campaign calling for a Soviet military reaction to the US spying attempt. Khrushchev's refusal to respond with force was certainly met with scorn from Mao. At this point, the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was starting to look like a bad breakup. And like any breakup, the group of mutual friends was choosing sides. The Soviet Union was trying to use it as an opportunity to repair its relationship with Yugoslavia, who was an outspoken critic of China. Albania, on the other hand, still longing for a Stalinist strongman, found itself even more alienated from the Soviet Union, who stopped all financial aid. China, however, used the opportunity to step in and allow Albania to resume building bunkers. 1960 saw Khrushchev slam Mao in public, referring to him as a nationalist and an adventurist, while addressing a congress of the Romanian Communist Party. Both sides accused each other of being revisionists and deviating from Marxism. So clearly there was a significant and growing ideological gap between the two leaderships of the two nations. But there was also an underlying factor that exacerbated the situation. Mao had accepted Stalin as the global leader of the communist movement. He did not accept Khrushchev, who he viewed as a weak and unwilling to lead world revolution. Mao was positioning himself to take on this role, the champion of the communist revolutionaries around the world. Two more events were to happen that would finally seal the split. We actually haven't gotten to them yet on this channel, but we will, we promise. The first was the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. As Kennedy and Khrushchev went toe-to-toe over the placement of nuclear weapons in Cuba and Turkey, the world held its breath. Although most people sighed a huge sigh of relief as an agreement was reached, Mao, who felt the Soviet Union must go to war, said that Khrushchev has moved from adventurism to capitulationism. The second event was the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Instead of Moscow supporting its fellow communist nation in the month-long border clash, it took the opportunity to strengthen its relationship with New Delhi, offering arms and technology to be used against the Chinese. Beijing, in extreme protest, broke off its diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. The split was now official. This was a largely unprecedented situation. Smaller breaks had occurred in the communist world before, the Yugoslavian rejection of Moscow most notably, but this was the two largest communist nations on the planet, openly hostile to each other and with no official channels of communication. This was a split that would actually continue to deepen and would not begin to be improved upon until the 1980s. We will of course be coming back to the effects of the Sino-Soviet split and its impact on global affairs, especially in Asia, but also in Africa, and overall how this affected the actions of the two superpowers. Please be sure you're subscribed to the channel and have pressed the bell button so that you don't miss those future episodes. As always, we're available via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com and are also active on both Facebook and Instagram. Please consider supporting us financially via YouTube membership or via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. Any support you may be able to